Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Board of Revenue Estimates, which is we're going to vote today on the results of the Revenue Monitoring Committee. As everyone knows, we have a very collegial, bipartisan, cooperative and collaborative approach, unlike many states where we have these nonpartisan numbers that we're suggesting to the legislature and the governor are the correct financial targets to judge the new budget by. So this is a great process that I think everybody is strongly in favor of. I see that Comptroller-elect Brooke Learman is in the audience, and everyone, if you could just give her a round of applause. I'd like to recognize at this point the board's executive secretary, director of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates, Robert Rearman, for his report. Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller and members of the board. And as the Comptroller mentioned, I just want to highlight as part of this cooperative process throughout agencies, not only thank the Bureau of Revenue Estimates for their work in producing these estimates, but also the assistance of the Revenue Monitoring Committee in reaching the consensus estimates that are being presented today. Next slide. Before I get into the numbers, I just want to provide a summary of our economic outlook and kind of the reasons for the changes that we are proposing today, which are modest over the 2 years. Since September, economists have become a little more pessimistic about the economic outlook, and they've lowered their growth expectations for both the U.S. and Maryland economy. However, in September, the board adopted a conservative outlook. And as a result, we're not making substantive changes to our macroeconomic outlook. In addition, year to date, our revenues are performing in line with our September expectations, which called for growth rates to come down significantly from the elevated rates of growth in the last 2 years. We are cautious on the economic outlook, given the elevated risk of a recession, and on an revenue estimate less than the last 2 years, but at a rate of growth that is less than what's typical for the state, and that's reflecting a slowing economy. So turning to the forecast, we propose to slightly adjust our fiscal 23 estimate by $55.8 million and total $23.7 billion. This is a decrease of about 1.3% relative to 22, but that largely reflects a large one-time transfer of $800 million from the personal income tax to the Blueprint Fund. Turning to 24, we are adjusting downward by $166.8 million our expectations for 24 and total $25.1 billion, a growth rate of 5.7%. Now, stripping out that large transfer on an ongoing basis, we project the general fund revenues will increase by 2.4 and 2.3% respectively. Next slide, please. I'm going to a distilled version of the forecast. First, we are not making any adjustments to our sales and use, corporate income tax, and our withholdings estimate within the personal income tax. In total, that's about 70% of our total general fund forecast, and that is not changing. And in fiscal 23, this slight upwards adjustment reflects increased expectations from smaller revenue sources, and in particular the estate tax, insurance premium tax, and we're getting more interest income. As I mentioned, our macroeconomic forecast is largely unchanged from September. However, we received an updated capital gains forecast. That's calling for a steeper decline in the next few years relative to what was assumed in September. In addition, relative to September, we have some additional data on individuals filing for refunds, and we're increasing our expectations for refunds under the personal income tax. So those two factors are driving that downward revision in our personal income tax and the overall downward revision in our estimate to 24. Next slide, please. This is an updated chart from September and putting that forecast in context, as I mentioned, these lower growth rates. These are average annual growth rates, the 5 years before the pandemic, which we kind of look at as a benchmark or normal rates of growth. And in the orange, these elevated growth rates in the last 2 years, they're really fueled by this federal pandemic assistance. And we know that that's firmly in the rearview mirror at this point. And turning to the individual income tax, we made a revision most significantly to fiscal 24, bringing that down by about 0.9%. The sales and use tax is telling a little bit different story, but this is the general fund and there's some distributional impacts going on there, I should say. Recent legislation is directing a greater portion of the sales and use tax to the blueprint, and that results in that slower growth rate in the general fund. So again, on that ongoing general fund basis, those growth rates of 2% are much lower than recent years and below kind of what we see as our benchmark rate of growth. Slide, please. Actually, can you skip the next one as well? Because I discussed that and go on to the next. Thank you. So at present, really our revenue structure is growing at a healthy rate, and all our most important economic data points are showing healthy growth rate. So we do not see an imminent risk of a recession absent a major economic shock. So we see if there is going to be a recession, we look to that as a downside risk, mostly to the fiscal 24 forecast. What's also important to consider is really if there is going to be a recession is the severity of it. And while economists are currently thinking that it will be a mild recession, we really don't know anything beyond it. Probably will not be like the last two. Another risk to the forecast that was highlighted in September are these volatile income sources, this non-wage income under the personal income tax, of which capital gains is one component, and that's driving some of the downward revision today. Right now, given the recent run-up in state revenues, it's also had a real high run-up in these non-wage income sources as well. So approximately 1 out of every $5 being deposited in general fund is from these sources. So if we're going to have a decline in this income source, which is very difficult to forecast, and they're very volatile, it's likely to have an outsized impact relative to prior years. And even though the labor market continues to grow and show strength relative to September, one risk that has emerged is more companies are announcing layoffs. And unusually, this has been in tech companies. And while you usually think of this as a California issue, and certainly disproportionately California is impacted, we looked at our layoff notices in calendar year 2022. And although the total layoff numbers are in line with a normal year, there's an elevated portion within the professional, scientific, and technical industries. And these are skilled workers that are really important in terms of driving our withholdings our withholding revenue growth. We did look at our withholdings, and we can look at by industry. We didn't see a slowdown there, but this is an unusual occurrence and one that we will continue to monitor. And as I mentioned, our major state revenue sources are not showing a concerning decline, but some of our minor or smaller revenue sources are particularly related to gambling and some casino revenues. But it's harder to extrapolate what that means for the economy, and that might be something specific to those revenue sources rather indicative of a slowing economy. And lastly, in the last few years, this federal pandemic assistance that was provided, consumers could save a lot of that, and they really helped improve their financial well-being. It's described as kind of record health of the American consumer. We've seen signs that that's reversing as of late. It's kind of normalizing, getting back to more normal levels. What that indicates is that inflation is probably hurting families' bottom line, individuals' bottom line, particularly impacting low to moderate income individuals, and they're accessing credit to sustain spending. We're also seeing some other signs in terms of increased hardship withdrawals from 401ks and a slight uptick in consumer delinquencies, particularly subprime automobiles. Slide, please. And turning to what continues to be the big macroeconomic story of the U.S. economy is this elevated inflation that is really just higher than anything we've seen in the last 4 decades. There's been some kind of welcome developments in the last few months. We're kind of coming off of this peak, and in particular, energy prices have declined, and nothing antagonizes the American consumer more than these high fuel costs, so that is welcome. But we're really very, very far from where we need to be to reach the Federal Reserve's goal of 2% inflation, roughly. So this is going to require that the Federal Reserve continue to raise interest rates in order to slow the economy to get to that desired level of price stability. And bringing this back to the forecast, there's some lags involved here in terms of the economy is really not showing fully the impact of these recent interest rate hikes. There's going to continue to be some future rate hikes. So the economy is not realizing or showing those impacts. And then there's going to be another lag likely between what shows up in the economy and what shows up in our state revenue structure. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through kind of our most important 3 macroeconomic variables in our forecast, starting with our jobs growth, or our jobs forecast. We are making a modest reduction in our expectations for job growth, but it's more lethargic growth. We are not forecasting a jobs recession or a decline in recession. So the next calendar year, we expect that job growth will be about half of the rate of the prior 2 calendar years. Slide. In a similar manner, we're adjusting downward our wage and salary forecast. However, at the September forecast, when we looked at our withholdings revenue, it was coming in weaker than the underlying data. So we made a further adjustment to our withholdings forecast and brought it down relative to the data at the time. So this revision is not impacting our withholding revenue forecast, which I mentioned is unchanged. Lastly, getting to personal income. This is probably our most important driver of our models. This is largely unchanged since September. This does have personal income by component. Starting with the gray, this is government transfers, which you see in the last 2 years were really an elevated rate. It was not only backfilling the loss of traditional personal income, but pushing total personal income growth well above historic norms. So I think this graph shows pretty well the history or actual revenue growth in the last few years, and then how we're returning to normal growth rates in the future. And this is reflected in our withholding revenue by fiscal year. So before the pandemic, 3 to 4% was a typical growth rate, and we've really been elevated in the last few years. We believe we will reach a peak growth rate in 22. And in 23, we do have a reduction in the growth rate. And when we look at it, it depends, it's been moving around a little bit. If you look at it on a quarter basis versus the back half of the calendar year, it's still growing at about 5 to 6%, and we expect it to continue to do so in the near future. As I mentioned, we have some weak job growth expectations. So in the near term, average wages have been higher than usual. So we're expecting that to kind of push up our withholding revenues a little higher than our pre-pandemic normal of 3 to 4%. Turning to our sales and use forecast, or sales and use tax forecast, I should say. This is total collections for 23. I think 2 takeaways I take from this is we're still growing at a really healthy rate. In the last quarter, well, that doesn't include December, we're going at nearly 6%. We do expect that quarterly number to come down because we've been softening in subsequent months. But that is, again, a high rate of growth at this time. Second, kind of in the forecast, as I talk about the slowing growth rate, we do have a significant decrease in the rate of growth in the back half of this fiscal year of about 2%. Then we forecast a slight recovery in 24 of slightly more than 2%. The next three slides, I'll kind of provide some more details on our capital gains forecast, since that is one of the driving factors in the changes that are proposed in the forecast. So we know financial markets have had a bad year. The benchmark S&P 500 down by about 17%. This compares to growth rates of over 15% in each of the last 3 years. And with the more speculative, more tech-oriented NASDAQ down significantly more at 30%. Unusually this year, bonds are having a really bad year. This is probably worst in a few decades, reflecting these rising interest rates. But then lastly, Maryland home prices are holding up. Year over year in October, they increased by slightly less than 3%. But this is a much slower growth rate, not only compared to recent calendar years, but compared to earlier this year. In addition, transactions and the number of sales are down significantly compared to prior years. As the change in our tax year forecast, predominantly in tax year 22 and 23, we have steeper growth rates. So translating that to our fiscal 24 downward revision in personal income tax, that's responsible for about $150 million in decreased general fund revenues. Given a long history of our capital gains, that volatility and the difficulty in forecasting it, we do have this 2-year decline of about 33%. We have had more significant declines, but those are really unusual events. Those were the dot-com, the end of that, the implosion of the dot-com, I should say, companies, and also the Great Recession. So at this point, we're really not thinking that we're going to have as significant decline as those two events. However, even though we build this decline in the near term, we still have an elevated amount of capital gains relative to what it was before this recent run-up. Kind of converting that to our personal income tax, how our components are changing. This is for tax year 22. Again, we're not changing our withholdings since that's the largest source. That kind of blunts any impacts. But we are changing our non-withholding components. For estimated payments, fiduciaries, and final payments, that's reflecting the decrease in capital gains. And as I mentioned, we do have increased expectations for refunds. So tying that back to fiscal 24, that decline, the capital gains is taking about $150 million. The increased refunds, similar magnitude. So combined, they're about $330 million in reduced general funds revenues. However, when we switch to September to December forecast, we use a new tax year to estimate how much has to be distributed for the local share. And that estimate has decreased, and that's blunting the impact of these two changes in our forecast and only netting out to that $176 million impact. That's a technical correction, and that doesn't mean local governments will receive less money. It's just what's distributed to the fund for future distributions. So in summary, we have a cautious outlook on the economy, and we believe that this forecast reflects that in these low growth rates that are not only lower than the elevated rates that we've seen in the last 2 years, but relative to what we kind of term as our normal rate of growth for the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And on behalf of my colleagues, Treasurer Davis and Secretary Brinkley, I really want to start just by thanking you, Mr. Director, and for the outstanding work in preparing this exceptional report. I also want to thank your entire staff, along with the Revenue Monitoring Committee, for their hard work in drawing up these estimates. You know, if we're able as a country to talk ourselves into a recession, we're going to do it because we keep hearing about it. Inflation, recession. I think we've got strong economic bones in Maryland, and we're going to see whatever happens is something that is going to affect us less than some other states, perhaps. It's the best way to put it. But I applaud the Revenue Monitoring Committee for their hard work. Creating these reports is challenging. The economic unpredictability of the pandemic has made it even harder, but it is the professionalism. People like Mark Nicole, Andy Schaffel, Robert, Mr. Farkas, where's he? David Farkas and other members, the professionalism that carries us through and allows us to make smart decisions that strengthen our economy, ensure our long-term growth, and safeguard the prosperity of the people of Maryland. So thank you all for that incredible work. As Mr. Rearman noted in his report, this board is being asked to approve recommendations that would increase our September 2022 revenue projections for fiscal year 2023 to $23.7 billion, an increase of $55.8 billion. Additionally, we are revising our official estimates for fiscal year 2024, which is now projected to be $25.1 billion, a decrease of $166.8 million. I'm going to just ask everybody to retain those figures because after we hear from my colleagues, we're going to make that motion. Our year-to-date revenue is performing as we expected since September's report, which anticipated more normal growth rates relative to the unusually strong recent growth due to the federal pandemic assistance. I will note the Board of Revenue estimates conservative approach, as Robert mentioned, with September's projection, helped minimize the impact of today's lowered economic forecast. I'll also point out that the change in our fiscal year 2024 projection reflects a decrease in capital gains income, something we anticipated in September. The fact that our withholding, sales and use tax and corporate income tax projections remain unchanged from September only reinforces the need for us to be prudent going forward. Today's report tells us that while we continue to see the benefit from federal stimulus payments, that impact will continue to fade. It's a stark reminder that the days of counting on federal stimulus money have come and gone. And we're going to have some kind of economic slowdown. I just emphasize that it's going to be, in my opinion, a soft landing that we're going to have down the road. And I could be wrong, but that's the sense that I have. While we're not seeing it overall in the state level right now, many people across our state are experiencing, however, financial hardships. So even a soft recession. While gas prices have thankfully gone down recently, the Federal Reserve continues to raise interest rates to combat inflation. But these rising inflation costs are squeezing the budgets of thousands of Marylanders, with many being forced to dip into their savings, take on more debt to make ends meet. Today's report shows that Maryland's overall fiscal health remains strong, but it's time to prepare for what will hopefully be a temporary, more austere future. We should use the information provided to us today as a crucial reminder to be cautious. As economic gravity grows stronger, it pulls us all further away from the prosperity we've had these past few years. With inflation rates continuing to rise and other factors looming, we must remain cautious with Maryland taxpayers' money. That's why it's critical for our new state leaders to take the information in this report and to make informed decisions on the state's budget and long-term fiscal health. And if my colleagues would indulge me for a few moments, I'd like to offer just a few remarks as I close out my 36 years of public service, more specifically 16 years as comptroller. Those are two different worlds. In the legislature, we love to spend other people's money. As comptroller, it's important to keep an eye on what's going on as far as the national economy and the state's economy. Well, let me just say it's been an absolute pleasure to work over the last 16 years with Treasurer Davis and Secretary Brinkley for part of that, and their predecessors, Treasurer Kopp and Secretary Foster, on this particular board, as well as the incredibly professional and competent staff at the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. The nonpartisan collaborative approach we have consistently utilized to guide the crucial work of this board has been a tremendous benefit to the people of the state of Maryland. Throughout my tenure as the state's chief fiscal officer, I've seen our economic and fiscal health deteriorate and also mount comebacks. I've seen steep budget cuts and unprecedented budget surpluses. I've seen periods of job growth and job losses. I can't emphasize enough the importance of heeding the lessons of the past and letting history guide the decisions of the future. Our fiscal and economic policies must be consistently focused on supporting working families, low-income residents, and small businesses. As time and again, they are the people who are so disproportionately the hardest hit by any kind of economic downturn, soft or severe. And these people are the most impacted by budget reductions, sometimes necessitated by these fiscal conditions. Leaders must continue to be very deliberative about new taxes enacted and think thoughtfully about our state's tax and business reputation across the country. Future administrations and legislatures must insist on getting desired results and outcomes for the investments that we make in our public programs and services, and demand transparency and accountability in how these taxpayer dollars are being expended. While the business of revenue forecasting is a complex scientific form of art, it is actually very predictable, as Robert indicated. For example, we know that the billions of dollars in revenue surpluses triggered by federal COVID spending will come to an end. And as today's revenue forecasts demonstrate, that time has come. We know that Maryland, given our tax base, is particularly impacted by volatility in our financial markets. And we know that our low wage earners continue to experience minimal to stagnant growth in their incomes and wealth. So while our state's economic and fiscal health will undoubtedly face challenges ahead, opportunities obviously await us. And I wish our incoming governor, comptroller, attorney general, and legislature, wish them the very best as they lead our state forward. And I, like all Marylanders, look forward to their leadership and the work that they will do for our great state. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues. Secretary Brinkley, any comments, or Treasurer Davis?
Go ahead, Derek.
Derek?
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller, and I'll be brief. I think you summarized a lot of things, and we don't need to, well, I don't need to repeat it. I want to start by acknowledging you, Mr. Comptroller, and you, Mr. Secretary, for your final BRE meeting. I want to thank you for your contributions to the state, and more specific, well, for me personally, I want to thank, yeah, you knew that was going to happen. Oh, that was embarrassing. I want to thank you for all that you did when I was coming on as treasurer to help ease my transition, the offer of assistance that you gave me, the advice, everything. This was an awesome responsibility, and I was able to, do some things in part because of the assistance that you gave me. So I just want to salute you for your service, your long service to the citizens of Maryland. I mean, we know how long the controller's been, but Secretary Brinkley and I came in together in the legislature in 94. So he's been around a long time too in various capacities. So I want to acknowledge those gentlemen for that. And more to why we're here. I'm not an economist, so I won't claim those few econ classes. I did get a minor in it somehow, but I'm sure there's a good reason for it. But plain and simple, this is just a Fed-induced recession. At some point, at the beginning of the year, we were told, I think there were going to be five rate hikes, and we've gone past that with promises of more. I think now it's less about inflation in terms of the conversation and more about recession. I mean, and that, again, it's a Fed-induced recession. The rising, when we talk about working families being hurt, are they being hurt more by the inflation or interest rates? See, when the reason why they keep raising, and again, I'm not an economist, so, and I'm venting now. So I'm having a moment. But when you look at it, the reason why they keep raising the interest rates is because it isn't working. They aren't able to stem consumer demand. They were still buying goods and services, and I'm not talking medicine and food. You know, let's put that aside. But just regular goods and services, they were fine with that. But when you look at like the cost of a house, I bought a house in February down on the Eastern Shore. What I paid for it now, then just in February, couldn't afford it now at the interest rate that they're charging now. That wasn't inflation. That was the Feds raising the interest rates. So when we look at, and you can go up and down the cycle about that, the things that are squeezing families, is it the interest rate? Or, I mean, is it the inflation or is it the interest rate? We do have to get inflation under control. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. But when we're talking about what's hurting our fellow Marylanders, what's hurting our fellow Americans, I think it's the interest rate. And to the point that what's going to happen even further is that as we raise it to a certain point, we start getting layoffs. Is that a good thing? If we're talking about helping working families, is layoffs going to help that? Because that's definitely going to come. That's all part of it, and it doesn't have to be. So that's, you know, I just sort of wanted to touch upon that, and then just to sort of close out, and the comptroller sort of mentioned it. We still have a responsibility to the citizens of the state of Maryland as it relates to delivering for them. See, where I sort of go a little bit differently with spending. I don't really have a problem with spending per se, because it's not, look, we're not putting a debt on my house. That money that we spend, it's not going, we're not building a deck on Derek Davis's home or renovating my offices and so forth. We're not doing that with that money. See, every dime that we spend as a state, it's helping somebody. Whether we're resurfacing their roads, improving their schools, healthcare, dealing with the inequity, and we saw what went on with the pandemic and the needs there. Every dime that we spend is we're spending other people's money, but we're spending it on them. Spending other people's money, but we're spending it on them to their benefit, to to the things they want. You know, Emerson once said that that every man make known what type of government which would command his respect, and that's one step towards obtaining it. And so that's how I see it. The folks are letting us know what it is they want, and so we're trying to meet those needs. So that's why I don't have a problem with it, because I know why we're doing it. But ultimately, and I'll just end with this. We are headed for tough days. We do have to tighten our belt. And I would say that's for all of us. I know with my office, we're scrutinizing the contracts that we do to make sure that we're getting the very best value for it. I won't just say the legislature, but I have to do my part too, as it relates to those contracts and those that come before BPW. I'm going to watch even closer from my perspective to make sure that we are getting the very best value for those bucks. And if I don't see that occurring, then I'm going to raise questions. I'm going to ask, why are we doing this? Are we getting our money's worth? And I think that's how we'll get through the next however many months, 8 year, 18, whatever it takes to get through what we're about to go through. So that ended up being longer than I thought. But again, I was having a moment, and that's what happened. So thank you very much, Mr.
I was having a moment just looking at all my predecessors up on the wall over there and thinking, there's a spot for Brooke Learman's photo, and that is going to be welcome news for the state. But thank you, Mr. Treasurer and Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first, let me thank both of you for your very kind words and addressed to me personally. And I do appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Have you here. I do want to commend Mr. Rearman and his work group, the whole team and the revenue monitoring work group for their hard work. And they do work hard. I think I've said this before, but you guys meet not just quarterly when we go through this. They keep tabs. I think if not weekly, it's every other week. And certainly they talk an awful lot back and forth on what they're seeing and what they're doing. So this is one of those activities beneath the surface where you see the duck going across, but underneath there's all that paddling that's happening. And they are the ones that certainly make that work. So I want to recognize them and their dedication to the whole process. It truly is an honor to work with such a great team and a very high caliber professional. So thank you, Robert. So since this is my last Board of Revenue Estimates meeting, certainly also for the comptroller, he made some personal references to that, and I'm going to do the same. I want to make note of what a great honor it's been to work with these two gentlemen and their teams over the past 8 years. I'm honored to serve with you, Mr. Treasurer, again, and your predecessor, Treasurer Kopp. What you may not realize is all four of us served in the House of Delegates at the same time when I came in, and the treasurer came in 95 was when we were sworn in. And at that time, we were all in there together. And also the former treasurer Dixon was in there too. So seems to be a pattern there. But it's been phenomenal working with these people over the decades. In my original draft I had from the previous millennia, the previous century. But we kind of have come through all that. But each of us in our respective roles have many different functions, which, sometimes they may not appear to be glamorous or exciting, but all of them have a major role in safeguarding and properly planning for the state's fiscal resources. And that is, frankly, for the benefit of the taxpayers and, more importantly, its citizens. So, I wanted to touch on that. Now to the revenue report. Although the quarter's numbers are slightly up for the current year, slightly down for the upcoming year from the previous estimates, the overall stability, I have to say, comes from teamwork. It's certainly a product of Governor Hogan's decisions and his leadership throughout his time in office. And it's no secret that due to the governor's prudent fiscal decisions, but also his cooperation with the legislature, and particularly with his colleagues, these two individuals on the Board of Public Works, is where we've how we've gotten to a lot of where we are. Our state's financial position is reflected in these updated projections, and it continues. It continues to be far ahead of what the projections had been many years ago. Now, granted, there was some pandemic got in the way, fiscal, federal stimulus got in the way, but those things were kind of common across the nation. What wasn't so common was how each state handled that. And this state has handled that admirably well. And it continues to be reflected by the bond rating agencies as they are the ones that scrutinize exactly what we're doing and how we're doing it. The governor is leaving the state in a far better fiscal position for his successor, Governor-elect Moore. And I know that all of us wish him well and will do anything we can to help ensure the success, because it's our state too. But the Governor Hogan, has left a great fiscal position for the incoming governor, and far better than that which he inherited. And in fact, better than any transfer in the state's history as we've transitioned government. But I can't let a Board of Revenue Estimates meeting pass without offering these 3 points of caution. I know some of the people in the press that we know these three are going to come back out, and they will. So while today's revenue numbers show the pendulum may be starting to swing the other way, we don't know. Time will tell. This is one of those things that you only can identify in the rearview mirror and not necessarily accurately in the windshield ahead of you. But the next several years will be critical to the state's long-term success, and the state needs to avoid getting sidetracked into passing expensive legislation. In my conversations with legislative budget team leaders, I believe they too understand this concept. But let's hope this message gets passed to the newly elected legislators as well. Second, remain committed to leaving a generous rainy day fund of at least 10% or more. In the last budget that we submitted, I think it ended up at 12%, but I think we submitted something in the 14, 15% neighborhood. Again, it's not so much that we're necessarily proud of having cash. We are happy and very glad to have a shock absorber so that when changes come, we have sufficient resources to deal with what has to be dealt with and not have significant shock waves pass through the state and therefore its delivery of services. So those are some of the challenges that we have. Today's numbers may be a hiccup, or they may foretell more challenging times ahead. We don't know. What we have done these past 8 years is provide options. We've provided options for both positive and negative eventualities. This should be a priority and not a convenience nor an afterthought as people are trying to deal with this. Third, finally, perhaps most importantly, remember it's OPM. Comptroller referenced it, that it's other people's money. And I've used this term since I was in the Senate and the House. It's other people's money, as in the taxpayers' money. Despite what some advocates are telling you, the full coffers in the bank is not necessarily the time for spending a spending free-for-all. And we have to be mindful of the forest, the state's forest, and by that I mean the fiscal forest, and not just an individual tree. If anything, use this as an opportunity to provide relief to Maryland's hardworking taxpayers, the hardworking taxpayers who are families. They are single-parent households. They are entrepreneurs, employers, AKA job creators, whatever you want to call them, and certainly their workers, their employees. And last but not least, because I'm soon to be one of them, a retiree, a senior. These people are ones that certainly have an awful lot of intellectual wisdom we'd love to retain in the state and not have them retire elsewhere. And they also want to stay here near their families. Keep them all in mind as you're proposing any type of legislation. So my concluding remarks are that while Governor Hogan's fiscal tune has remained consistent throughout his term in office, Maryland's best path forward is to continue to show restraint, save for a rainy day, and spend, or at least look at spending as an investment, and when doing so, do it responsibly. I'd like to say thank you to many, many people. First to Governor Hogan and Lieutenant Governor Rutherford for entrusting me and my team to assist them in this very important chapter of changing Maryland. And I'd like to think that this portion has been extremely successful. Thank you, Mr. Comptroller, Mr. Treasurer, and also your predecessor for this work and the other areas in which I've been privileged to work with all of you because we've cross-pollinated a lot of different areas. And I didn't know that necessarily in all the details when I came into this role, but I certainly have grown into that and really, really, truly have enjoyed that. I want to thank Team DBM, Mark, Cindy, everybody there. I can't start to name them because then I'm going to leave a lot of people out. They've endured me and my ways of working through these 8 years, sometimes late night emails, more likely early morning emails, or, just a call out of the blue to try to deal with things. I want to thank my family, my sisters, my late son Ross, and my daughter Margaret, and especially my wife Beth. Because let me tell you, there's some times that go on, I go, really, you have to do this? Yes, I have to do this. And, but it's been a phenomenal challenge and also the most rewarding part of my career here in Annapolis. And none of it would have happened without my family and their support. So I really appreciate that. So, Mr. Chairman, if appropriate, I'd certainly like to make the motion, but however you want to see fit.
If you could make the motion to accept the estimates, that would be terrific.
I make the motion that we accept the estimates as presented by Mr. Rearman and his team.
I'll second that.
Anyone opposed?
There's no one left.
So it's unanimous for all here, and thank you very much for attending. And Mr. Secretary and Mr. Treasurer, thank you very much for your comments. All the
Good
best.
job.
By the way, folks, I screwed up. That was not Emerson, that was Thoreau I was quoting. It just kicked in. I'm like, that's Henry David Thoreau. But,
Oh, so you got the degree in economics. So.
yeah.
Thanks.
Good job, man.